back to Neon Liberalism. This week, I want to talk about strange bedfellows. I personally, have been very surprised by some political developments over the last several years. People who I grew up with thinking of as the enemy, basically. People like David Frum or Bill Kristol, who have made what progressives might call face turns in the last several years, who have come out pretty unabashedly pro-democracy, pro-trans rights in the case of Kristol, um, and generally moved in some sense from the Republican Party and over to the Democratic Party, broadly speaking. And they're hardly the only ones, right? Liz Cheney, a classical, rock Republican, campaigned for Kamala Harris. Um, there are also the libertarian crowd who have, in some ways, in some fashion, moved pretty substantially politically. And so I wanted to have on someone from that movement, someone who's more familiar with that history than I am, to try and talk about that, to try and talk about where this all came from, where they're going, and how we should all feel about being in a political coalition together. So, Aaron Ross Powell, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, I guess my first question for you is, what's your take on this movement and your place in it?
I think this movement is complicated and inconsistent, and it's not as simple as there were a bunch of libertarians who allied for historical reasons, fusionist reasons, with the Republicans largely, or saw themselves as having more affinity with that side of the aisle, and now have moved to consider themselves Democrats. So most of the libertarians I know who have been extremely anti-Trump from the beginning, and then increasingly so, especially in this second administration with all of its horrors. I don't think they would say I am a Democrat now. I wouldn't say I am a Democrat now. I would not say I'm a part of the Democratic Party. Um, but I think it's a couple of things. One is the old fusionist system clearly broke down. I would argue it never really existed in the first place, that there wasn't an alliance between libertarians and conservatives. It was more that libertarians were a junior partner in the right coalition and kind of provided ideological cover for a lot of conservatism, because libertarians, even if you think they're wrong, the arguments that they're making are grounded in a set of principles that then derive their policy prescriptions from, versus I think a lot of conservatism and like right wingness is kind of just base urges given a veneer. And in a lot of cases, fusionism enabled them to take something of a libertarian veneer, which sounds better to a lot of people. Individual rights, liberty, free enterprise, and open markets, like those are kind of baked into a lot of the American experience, in important ways.
So,
So I think,
I actually kind of want to ask you about fusionism. I mean, while
sure,
we're here, for people in the audience who maybe aren't familiar with it, what's fusionism?
fusionism is the idea, or was the idea, that kind of there are two versions of it. One was libertarianism. One way to view it is simply about a claim regarding state power and the legitimacy of state power. So it says that most, if not all, depending on what kind of libertarian you are, state power is, on the one hand, morally unjustified. Like, we can't ground it in, why does the state get to exercise power in ways that, like, you, Samantha, couldn't exercise over other people, and that the arguments for why don't hold up to scrutiny. So that state power is to a degree illegitimate, and so needs to be reduced. And then also that a lot of what the state does, even when the state is trying to help, is not actually helpful. It's harmful. A lot of regulations make situations worse rather than better, interventions, spending, those kinds of arguments. So there's like a moral version, and then there's like a utilitarian kind of just the consequences of public policy version. Um, and that's simply about, that doesn't really say much about kind of how we ought to live, what society should look like, how we should relate to each other. It's just about this question of like, when is the state allowed to use coercive force to guide society? And and then the argument was, well, that's not good enough. You can't like run a society, you can't run a politics on just saying like the only answer is shrink government, smash the state. Like you have to have other conversations too. And so you needed values injected into this. And the argument was that the values that were supportive of these kinds of views about the state were traditionally conservative values about individual responsibility and respect for institutions and the principles of the American founding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so libertarianism really needed conservative values and philosophy to kind of complete its picture of the world and its governing philosophy. The other prong of it was, look, this is a two-party system. If you want to get anything done, you have to pick a side, because if you don't pick a side and you try to just say, well, like we'll work with some people and work with other people, you're not going to have any friends in Washington. So you need to pick a side. And at the time that these conversations, the time that fusionism was emerging, which is the middle of the 20th century, the argument was the right, conservatism, the GOP was primarily more friendly to markets, or at least I would argue like rhetorically more friendly to markets than the left. And so we needed to pick a side, and we picked that side. This grew out of this period where like anti-communism was baked into a lot of this, because it was like, well, the right, communism was kind of the antithesis of libertarianism, and the right were the ones who were anti-communists, and so there was also like an enemy of my enemy kind of thing. Um, but communism isn't really an issue anymore. The Soviet Union fell. Um, but there was then a path dependency that kicked in. That once you kind of decided you were going to ally on the right, your friends were on the right. The people who were coming into the movement, typically, most libertarians came to it from the right versus the left, and so on. And so then there just was kind of like a cultural, and to use Tyler Cowen's term, like a mood affiliation going on that perpetuated this feeling more comfortable among the right than among the left.
Yeah, so this is something that I had wanted to ask you about. Is this mid 20th century political context that, fusionism emerges in as a strategy? Um, and to me, it looks like there are like two big things happening in the middle of the 20th century, and one of them is the Cold War, and the other one is civil rights. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how fusionism and the libertarian movement are shaped by these political contexts.
I think a lot of the civil rights stuff, the way that libertarians justified staying in the right wing coalition during the civil rights movement, which was clearly a lot of people who had been denied liberty demanding it for themselves, which ought to have been a very libertarian cause. You know, just like libertarians like to trace a lot of the origins of American libertarianism to the abolitionist movement. I think the way that they were able to square that, though, was to say, look, a lot of the policies that are being advanced by the left in order to advance civil rights are more government intervention. They're compelling private individuals, private firms to behave in certain ways and so on. And that's not the right answer. The right answer is to get government out, to stop allowing states to enforce segregation and so on, and that market forces will correct. The kind of classic argument is like, if you're a firm that refuses to hire minorities, then you're going to be paying more for lower quality workers because the pool of workers you can draw from is smaller than the firm across the street that's happy to hire minorities or women, or different ethnicities and so on, because they have a bigger pool to draw from. And so the market will correct for these things. That the reason that segregation and inequalities persist is because the government's been kind of intervening and preventing market forces from correcting. And so you can tell yourself this story, but I also think that at the time there were simply, because it had been drawing from the right for as long as it had, um, there were also just a lot of people who disagreed with the civil rights movement. Um, and I think we're seeing that now. Like, you see a lot of kind of race and IQ stuff is still prevalent in some libertarian circles. A lot of like evolutionary psychology as a way to justify like misogynistic beliefs is still popular. So there was like a cultural right wingness that had been imported from this fusionist project.
So
Um, yeah,
do you think that that story is plausible, right? That if we had taken a different path with the Civil Rights Acts, and it's just going to be targeted at government oppression, right? We're going to get the government to stop enforcing segregation de jure. Do you think that freedom from the government and market forces would have been enough to undo the private terror of Jim Crow?
I think it certainly would have helped. I don't know that it would have been enough, and I don't know that we can be certain because there were a lot of forces at work. But I mean, we do know that restrictive zoning played a large role in maintaining poverty,
Still
maintaining
does.
segregation. We know that school segregation in public schools, like there was a lot of state mandated, enforced, run segregation and other policies that were reinforcing racial inequalities of wealth, of power, of status, and so on. So I think it's just stands to reason. It seems perfectly true to me that if we had actually gotten rid of all of that, enforced, it would have helped. Whether
Hmm.
it would get us all the way, I do think that one of the things that it turns out is true is the market forces depended market the idea that market forces would correct it entirely, um, depends upon people really only caring about like their business's bottom line. But it turns out a lot of people are willing to pay significant costs to be racist. Like, they just don't, even if they knew their business would make 10% more in profits, 20%, whatever the number you want to pick, if they hired black people, there would be quite a lot of people throughout the South and elsewhere. And I think people even today who would say, like, I'm not going to do it, or hiring women and so on. Um, so I guess I don't know that it would have gone all the way. I think it definitely would have helped,
Hmm.
but we didn't really even do it because a lot of those like policies are still in place today, as you said, like with zoning.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's recently been some discussion on Blue Sky about the history of the desegregation of the military and how it was specifically the pressure of war that led us to desegregate the military. Because we realized that excluding a large part of people from society and treating them as second class citizens was like that, it was inefficient and we had no other choice. But it was inefficient before the war started. It was just, an inefficiency that white society could tolerate. And I think you can see certain kinds of parallels to domestic affairs. Um, so, but that's a whole. I mean, I guess it's a very long question. But I do want to focus a little bit on the history that's more relevant to today. So we have this fusionist coalition that's, like you say, a little bit uneasy in certain respects. And there's a little, and it's not just how to put this, and it's going both ways, right? Theoretically, there's influence going in both directions. Like you say, there's kind of mood affiliation with the broader conservative reactionary tendencies in the Republican Party. And this persists for quite a while. and it breaks down. It feels like it's broken down pretty catastrophically over the last 10 years. So can you talk a little bit about the breakdown? Like what happened?
I think it just became much harder to rhetorically maintain the pretense that there was even that it even made sense to begin with. Because I would say it's not like it I don't think it actually worked for a while and then broke down. I think it was
Okay.
always incoherent. That
Okay.
libertarianism, if you take it seriously, libertarianism is incredibly corrosive to traditional hierarchies and power structures. That those hierarchies and power structures are to a great extent a product of state reinforcement. That if you want society to be static, you want culture to continue to look the way today that it did when you were a kid or when your grandparents were kids, you need to be constantly intervening in the economy and society because people change and people are diverse and dynamic. And so libertarianism taken seriously is like a philosophy of radical dynamism. Conservatism is, and particularly like its hard right forms, is either a philosophy of radical stasis or one of radical reaction back to an imagined stasis. So they're philosophically incompatible. It had to break down at some point. Like
Mhm.
if you at all believe in stasis and claim to be a libertarian, at some point you have to give up one of those two beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point about the necessity of state intervention, and again, like again, I think Jim Crow is a good example. There's an enormous amount of private terror in the Jim Crow period, but it's also backstopped by state power, right? The state power isn't always necessarily there, but it does show up, right? The sheriff will show up and murder the civil rights activist. The sheriff will back up the lynch mob or decline to prosecute or arrest the protesters or like you say, like, the government will pass various kinds of laws that create de jure segregation. So that's obviously a component of that particular conservative regime and conservative
I'd
regimes generally.
I'd also note that inaction is a form of backstopping too, because lynching is murder. And if you choose not to enforce the laws against murder when it's a group of white men lynching a black man, that's inaction. It's not the state directly intervening, but it is a form of backstopping. If the state applied the laws equally, it would prosecute, but
Okay.
it
Yeah,
chose
no,
not to.
I think that's quite right. Um, and so, but I want to get back to this question of how to say. So maybe, like you say, maybe it was always a bit incoherent. Maybe breakdown was inevitable, but it happened at a specific time,
Yes.
right? And one thing, obviously, that happened is that the Cold War is over. Capitalism won the Cold War. The Soviet Union implodes. World communism isn't a thing anymore. But that's not when the libertarian fusionist program breaks down. The right to be kind of obvious about it, it breaks down under Trump, um, if I understand correctly. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this rupture.
I suspect part of that is just a lag time. So the Cold War conservatism reached its apotheosis with Reagan, who was bad in all sorts of ways, but spoke in, you can imagine kind of a fusionism working under Reagan
Mm-hmm.
story. And and then we had his VP, and then we had his VP's son, right? Like there's kind of a continuing legacy of Cold War fusionist republicanism until Trump. So I think it might have just taken a while for kind of the heights of American conservatism to catch up to the fact that the Cold War was over and other concerns became primary for them. But it is correct, it did break down under Trump. It didn't break down when, say, the Berlin Wall fell or the Soviet Union fell.
Didn't break down when we
And
invaded Iraq either.
and I think a lot of that is the GOP essentially reverting to the mean. that I think it's easy for us to think that American conservatism and the GOP was kind of always this Goldwater Reagan vibe, right? But it wasn't. It was the John Birch Society. It was like conservatism prior to the the rise of those guys and kind of the Reagan consensus looked much more like it does under Trump. And the base was always like this, was always there. What happened was Trump, and we can, there are various narratives about how he managed to gain control of the GOP. But when he did and when he became its figurehead, it was a reassertion of that base. It was kind of the elites lost control of the GOP. The Paul Ryan couldn't, was no longer the head of the Republican Party, and instead it became the base taking over. And the base was never remotely libertarian. Like you couldn't even say, we used to say like you know, they're socially, they're fiscally conservative and socially liberal, right? But that's not the base. And it turned out that fiscally conservative didn't actually mean free markets. It meant Josh Hawley getting really mad that free markets changed society away from kind of this pastoral halcyon days that he longs for, where women stayed in the home and whites were in charge and everyone was a certain kind of Protestant. That's what it always was. And so what we saw under Trump is a reassertion of that. And the real breakdown, I think, came from a lot of libertarians were willing to overlook profound liberalism in the social sphere from their allies, being drug warriors, opposing gay marriage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As long as they were talking a good game about tax levels and regulations and other things that fell under economic libertarianism. But then they
So
stopped. Trump's not remotely economically libertarian, and so it just became impossible to maintain the pretext.
yeah, I mean, so again, speaking as someone who's not from a libertarian background at all, growing up, my understanding of libertarians, my perception of libertarians was that they were all hypocrites, right? A libertarian was somebody who would tell you that the income tax was slavery, but slavery was just a market transaction, um, right? That they were extremely upset about high taxes on people like them specifically, but then other kinds of things, it seemed pretty plainly like an interference in liberty. Like you say, bans on gay marriage, bans on abortion, attacks on trans people, legal segregation, all this other stuff they didn't really care about. And so that was my perception of libertarians, was that they were just unprincipled hypocrites. And I've been kind of surprised over the last several years to see that at least some of them actually seem to have meant it when they talked about liberty and freedom for all. And so I guess what how could you like what was the difference, right? What was the difference between the libertarians who meant it and the libertarians who went Trump?
You're right that a lot of them meant it. And I think a lot of them meant it, a lot more of them meant it than a lot of people outside of the libertarian movement believed. And I know that, when I was first joined the Cato Institute in, what was it, 2009, we would, there'd be these articles that were just kind of screeds against libertarianism. And I and my colleagues would read them and genuinely like, this just doesn't represent us. Like these people have not talked to us. We don't believe the things that they're saying we believe. Um, there was this is all just kind of about getting what's mine and screwing everyone else. That greed's the primary motivator. And that was never true for me, and it was never true for a lot of my colleagues. It was, I think, true for a lot of what we call like internet libertarians. And there was, I think that's part of it, is there was a real divide between libertarianism as it existed in like Washington D.C. at kind of the elite institutions, and libertarianism as it existed in like weird corners of the internet and young people who were reading Lou Rockwell and Hans Hermann Hoppe and so on, who no one in D.C. was paying attention to. I used to have my old boss David Bowes, executive vice president of the Cato Institute. Um, I used to tell him like we should be paying more attention to like these people at like the Mises Institute and these kind of far right people talking libertarian, because they're getting a ton of attention online. They have lots of followers on this newfangled Twitter. They are getting a lot on YouTube. They're like, we should be paying more. And he's like, no, but they're not publishing op-eds in the Washington Post or the New York Times. They're not appearing on cable news. Like all of the kind of signals of prominence inside the Beltway, they didn't have. And so they didn't matter. There was no point in even talking about them or acknowledging their existence. And I think one of the things that you've seen in this split is that they basically have taken over, like they took over the Libertarian Party. They've taken over like kind of the online aspects of the movement, and they're just who they always were. And a lot of the like kind of more elite circles libertarians are who they always were, but the divide, you're like seeing both of them a lot more. And and so I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is there's there are libertarians who really kind of always meant it in the sense of caring about social liberalism. And there were other ones who I think genuinely cared about like social liberalism in the sense they wanted to end the war on drugs. They supported gay rights and so on. You know, the libertarian movement was really politically, like the Libertarian Party was at the forefront of gay rights. Long before the Democrats caught up, the Libertarian Party was pushing for gay rights. Um, and but I think there was just an emphasis. Like you care when you get into libertarianism, a lot of what you're reading is economics. Most of the scholars who are kind of self-consciously libertarian are either coming from economics or kind of rationalist political philosophy, but they often are thinking economically. The critique of the left is always they get like the economics wrong. When you become a policy wonk, a lot of it is about economics. And and so, like right now, where I see one of the real divides is the people who are hyper specialized in their area. They really care about like this particular policy. They're just like fiscal policy or housing policy or health policy or whatever. And that's just true of like anyone who kind of works in policy as you hyper specialize. And but then you get like blinders. And so you say like, well, I in this area, they're cutting government, right? They're reducing taxes, etc. And so that's what I care about. And I'm kind of blind to the rest of it versus libertarians who aren't blind to the rest of it. And I think view it holistically that don't see this as actually being about reducing government, actually about reducing spending, but instead like bending the federal government to the whims of one guy. Um, and and so that's a lot of it is that divide, I think. It's like the people who are just all I care about is shrinking the size of government on paper versus the people who are like, what I actually care about is like the experience of liberty for everyone.
Yeah, so I think this gets back to something you mentioned at the beginning, this distinction between like the liberty arguments for libertarianism that's all about state power and so forth, and the economic efficiency arguments against certain kinds of policy. Um, and I know there are libertarians out there who tend to focus more on the social stuff. Probably the most notable one is Bradley Balco, who, my understanding, does have a libertarian background, but mostly what he writes about is police violence and police brutality. Which I mean, you can make a very clear case. Like this is like the thing when it comes to the state intervening unjustly on private citizens. This is like state violence in its purest form. And so I can see exactly how that ties into libertarian concerns. And I guess one of my questions is why did the libertarian movement become so identified with the economic side of things rather than the political liberty side of things?
Fusionism. Again, I So if you want to be friends with, so imagine you're back in kind of that era of like what we might call like Reagan style republicanism, or like proto Reagan style republicanism. So before the turn back to populism under Trump. And you want to get along with your friends who are conservatives and these style of Republicans, you find the areas that you agree on, and you don't talk as much about the areas that you disagree on. And the areas where they agreed on, and I'd argue it was largely rhetorical on the part of the Republicans, um, was free enterprise, limited government, free markets, etc. Uh, Also, if you see the primary threat to liberty being communism and socialism, not in like our friend Matt McManus's sense, but state ownership of the means of production kind of socialism. Um, that's about economics, and the arguments against it are economic. I think it's also the case that just economics as a discipline is much more libertarian than other disciplines. Like PhD economists tend to be much more pro markets than non PhD economists. Even PhD economists who consider themselves to be progressives are probably more pro markets than, Paul Krugman. It's opposed tariffs long before it was like the popular thing among Democrats. Uh, and and so I think economics was kind of conducive to libertarian thinking. There was the That created like a path dependency. If you get into libertarianism, or at least when I was kind of getting into it as an undergrad in the late 90s, early 2000s, you were always getting recommended economic stuff to read. And so I think that was a lot of it. But at the same time, it's not exclusively it. As I said, like libertarians were fighting against the drug war vocally for a long time. Libertarians were fighting for gay rights vocally for a long time. When I was at David Bose's house taking care of him as he was dying last summer, um, he had a whole wall covered with articles that he had published in major publications arguing for gay rights. Like um, that was his core issue for most of his life. So I think that was always there. It's just that the economics gave you a way to kind of be part of this coalition, and it was a way to fight back against what at the time was seen as like the biggest threats to liberty on like a grand scale was, rightly or wrongly, like I think the Soviet Union, we can argue about how much of a threat it actually was, but was viewed as the Soviet Union and communism and Hayek's like road to serfdom arguments and so on.
Yeah, I am much more sympathetic to people who are against communism than I think the average progressive. But I don't really want to talk too much about that. I guess I want to kind of bring things back to where we are today. Because there's something you said at the outset that you don't consider yourself a Democrat or a member of the Democratic Party. And I think that's interesting to contrast with I think the Niscan. I can't remember. I can never know, never tell if it's Niskanen or Niskanen. Um,
Niskanen.
Niskanen, thank you. The Niskanen Center had an essay out about a year and a half ago called "The Rise of the Abundance Faction," where basically they argue we used to be fusionists. Fusionism is dead. It's time to fusionism with the Democratic Party. That if we want to pass any of the policies we want to pass about zoning reform or permitting reform or any of these other kinds of economic policies, the only place to be doing that now is within the Democratic Party. That's the only place to have serious policy conversation. And so we just need to recognize that and make ourselves a part of that coalition and act as a faction within the Democratic Party. And I'm curious what you think about that, or maybe just how you see yourself in the current political context.
I can see the persuasiveness of that argument, where the reason that I would not sign up for it is first because uncomfortable with partisan affiliation in general. Um, I'm uncomfortable with kind of like signing up. I think it's weird when people are even like enthusiastic about a politician. It kind of just like makes me, it's kind of skeezy or something. I don't know. But so there's like a distance from kind of politics for me personally. But this is also why I never became a policy analyst, right? I got into like philosophy um, and became like a generalist, and is because it just that's not where my head is. And I'm glad that I no longer work inside the Beltway because it just it wasn't for me. Uh, but the other concern that I have is one of the reasons I think fusionism was a strategic error from the beginning was that the argument that you have to pick that like one of the arguments for picking a side is that the other side will like not trust you if you work with them, if you work with the other guys at all. So you might as well just pick a side. And I think there's something to the idea that if you are seen as a member of one coalition, the other coalition views you as with suspicion. Where I think it got wrong was to say, therefore, pick one of the coalitions. I think I'm uncomfortable with being part of a partisan coalition because, as we've seen, partisan coalitions change. They change their views. The Democrats look different today than they did in the 1970s. I mean, hell, the growth in support for free trade is like like opposition to tariffs is like in the high 80s, I think, among Democrats now at like the last polling that I saw, which is like that's like Milton Friedman level, right? Um, does that mean they're now the party of free trade? Because they certainly weren't not too long ago, right? Um, or is this just like negative partisanship? And as soon as Democrats are back in power, they'll go back to like wanting to be protectionist for, you know, to protect working class jobs and so on. Um, so
So,
I'm uncomfortable with like embedding yourself. That said, I do think it's absolutely true that right now the future of American liberalism and within it like American libertarianism depends upon, well, the Democrats winning in 2028, because right now we have an authoritarian fascist regime that's attempting to consolidate authoritarian fascism, which is, even if they're cutting some government jobs, man, that's not libertarian. So, but I what I don't want is a counter fusionism, because a counter fusionism creates. I don't see why a counter fusionism with the left wouldn't create a similar set of problems that the fusionism with the right did.
so I think this is an interesting topic, right? And I can see how looking at the history of fusionism and looking at how it kind of infected the liberty movement with a kind of social conservatism, you'd be very leery of doing it again. Um, from my perspective, these kinds of partisan identification driven, ideology shifts aren't necessarily or aren't always a bad thing, right? And like to me, like the evolution of Bill Kristol on these kinds of social questions is kind of fascinating. Right, back when he was a neocon, back in the Bush days, he had all kinds of op-eds about this or that social issue, and he mostly came down on the conservative side. And these days, you see him basically, being a staunch defender of trans rights, right? Saying that it's abominable what Republicans are doing to trans rights, and you can see like this is very plainly right. He didn't move over to the progressive side because of trans rights in the first place. He broke with, Republicans over this question of authoritarianism. But once he did it, you could see how that also split him off from a lot of other political identifications that he carried with him as a Republican and has adopted things that I think are more correct. And I think, how to put this, I think it's just generally true that you are always going to be embedded in some kind of ideological context, some kind of discursive context, some kind of political context, right? There are going to be people who you read and respect and care about and are in dialogue with. and there are going to be others who you aren't, just because we live in a finite world with finite time, and that interchange of ideas, the way that people change ideas and develop over time, can be a valuable thing. Um, so I guess to turn this into a question, maybe a pointed question, um, what's something you've changed your mind about?
I
I mean, the
think
answer might be just nothing,
yeah.
and
No, I mean,
that's fine too.
I don't, and this may be me being like kind of this maybe me being less critically reflective than I ought to be, but I don't think that in a lot of cases, like my policy views have changed. I think where my perspective has really changed over the last 8 or 10 years is in really acknowledging um, where there are impositions on people's liberty and dignity and autonomy that I was paying less attention to. And this is where I think like your Bill Crystal thing is speaks to what I was getting at, which is there are a lot of libertarians who are really kind of suspicious of trans rights or buy into the narratives about the dangers of gender affirming care, particularly for minors, or just like the prevalence of gender affirming care. They buy into like kind of the like Barry Weiss or New York Times opinion section narratives about this stuff. And and so on the one hand, like if they spent more time actually talking with trans people and not just talking with kind of reactionary centrist elites who themselves don't spend any time talking with trans people or reading The Atlantic on this stuff versus reading trans writers on these issues, it would be helpful and I think change a lot of their perspectives. But I don't think that that would represent a turn away from libertarianism and towards progressivism, because I think that libertarian principles taken seriously point towards radical support for trans rights. So it's not about shifting their values to something. It's about seeing the how their stated principles apply to this area. And I think that for me is where my views have changed, or the way that I present my views has changed over the last 8 or 10 years isn't exactly that, is in kind of like getting away from the economics is the whole story, even though I still am radically free market and pro private property and freedom of exchange and all those libertarian things, to saying, and these other spheres matter just as much. And someone who opposes liberty in these other spheres, well, maybe genuinely, maybe rhetorically supporting liberty in the economic sphere, is not a libertarian and should not be treated as like an across the board ally, or that we should be consistent in our applications. This was one of the things that kind of bothered me about some of the institutional libertarianism in Washington, D.C., is they would be very friendly with like Republican lawmakers who were wretched on all kinds of liberty related issues, but spoke a good game. But progressives who were very, very libertarian on all sorts of on drug war, on gay rights, on surveillance, on police reform, on criminal justice reform, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because those people also happened to think that the state should have a greater role in healthcare, which I would disagree with them on, and like a lot of their policies I would disagree with in that area. But because they happen to deviate in those particular areas, they were anathema. You couldn't associate with them. Um, I think that's really where I changed, is in coming to see how narrowly applied a lot of these principles were, and um, and how you kind of get taught as like a young libertarian to really only pay attention to certain things and not pay attention to other things, or to view certain heterodox thinkers as being necessarily correct because the orthodoxy is progressive left and therefore the orthodoxy must be wrong and therefore anyone who disagrees with the orthodoxy must be right is a really kind of corrupting intellectual influence, but is very prevalent in the libertarian movement. Um, so I think that's really where I've changed is in recognizing kind of how narrow my perspective was, and in broadening it, and in broadening it, seeing like, oh, I was kind of buying bad arguments in some areas, or being naive in others.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I think, I mean, my own perspective on these Republicans who talked a good game about economic freedom. I think they believed in free markets as long as they thought that free markets were going to deliver conservative social outcomes. And as we're seeing today, where you can see on some level Trump, MAGA have looked at free markets and are like, man, these free markets are delivering outcomes we don't like. It is time for significantly more unfree markets. We're going to introduce this tariff and this regulation, and we're just going to directly pressure this corporation to change what kind of soda they carry. Right? We're like that's something that just happened. Is now Kennedy is pressuring companies to put cane sugar in their soda instead of corn syrup, and just because he thinks it's healthier, because he has this kind of like social vision for America, and he doesn't care what the market thinks. He wants this outcome, so they're going to use state power to do it. Um, so that's yes, that's an interesting change of perspective there. Um, and I guess so. As someone who is, like I said, more progressive, um, my question for you, would be, what's your most important area of disagreement with progressivism, and why do you think you're right about it?
The area where I find myself disagreeing with my progressive friends the most is in how willing they are to overlook what it means for the state to do something, to intervene. That I think the arguments that like the state is ultimately the application of violence in order to achieve change. Like that's what a law is. A law is a threat to carry out violence if you disobey it. And that can be necessary. There are laws that are good and ought to be enforced, and even if that force enforcement requires the application of violence, but it also means that the state is incredibly dangerous, and when corrupted can be harmful at orders of magnitude beyond what private individuals can do. And I often see progressives who are just, here's something that I think would be, the world would be better if we can pass a law that will make it that way. And then we're kind of done. We don't think about like what it means to have that law in the books, what it means to have enforcement of that law. We should ban cigarettes. Cigarettes are bad for you. Let's ban them. But banning them gets you police officers kneeling on the neck of Eric Garner, right? Like poor Garner was a chokehold, I think, like because he was selling black market cigarettes. It's that it's kind of ignoring what the state is and being blasé about the application of state force. And this shows up a lot in the economic realm. Like I think progressives often also do, like libertarians are right that a lot of progressivism doesn't really pay attention to economic incentives the way that it ought to. Uh, the we can see this in the like debates about housing policy. Like the way you make housing less expensive is to just build more of it, like increase supply to catch up to demand. Like this is just kind of basic economics, but whole like huge number of progressives just don't want to believe that at all. But that's really where I'm like, guys, even like where you and I share goals about like the ideal world would look like this. This is what we'd like to achieve in the world. the mechanisms that you're using to do it, you haven't really looked at closely or aren't really paying attention to what they look like in practice, or are risking what we're seeing now, which is we spent a long time investing a lot of power in the executive branch and in government because they could get things done from a progressive direction. And now that power is getting used in really awful ways. And and I hope they learn the lesson of like maybe don't give the
So,
state all of this power, but that's yeah, so that's it. It's like what is the state, what's its application, and how worried about it should we be?
okay, so I mean, on the federal level, I wouldn't really want to blame progressives for creating ICE and for creating that kind of immigration enforcement apparatus, but set that aside. Um, or to try and take what you were saying and put it in more progressive language, I want to focus on the example of environmentalism. Right? Because today we can look at the world and we say, okay, there's the California Environmental Quality Act or the National Environmental Policy Act. And what these acts say they do, what people think they do, is they're environmental laws. They protect the environment. And then in practice, what these laws do is give people a right to sue in order to stop things from happening. And the government shows in and says, "I'm sorry, you can't do this until you've completed this kind of environmental review, and that's going to take you 7 years and millions of dollars." And so they get used as a brake on construction of all kinds, but especially construction of housing, construction of green energy, construction of transmission lines and battery plants and turbine plants, wind turbine plants, right? So there's this contrast between like, okay, nominally there's something we wanted to protect the environment, but then we look through the implementation of the law and it's not delivering that to us. But I think it's also worth remembering that the goal in question is pretty important, right? You look at the era that these laws that we're complaining about today are getting passed in, and this is an era when rivers in America were catching on fire. Um, the Cuyahoga River famously caught on fire, but the funny thing is, it caught on fire a bunch of times. It didn't just catch on fire once, it caught on fire over and over because it was so choked with industrial runoff. Um, right, that you look at pictures of Los Angeles from the 60s and 70s, and it's not that they put an old timey sepia filter
Yeah.
on it, it's that there's so much pollution in the air that it's dark at midday or yellow at midday. Right, so there are genuine problems in the world that maybe we wanted to have environmental laws to solve, right? That we didn't just want to leave it to the free market when it comes to these issues. So I'm curious how you think about these kinds of problems.
I think this raises actually like a really interesting intellectual error I notice among a lot of libertarians, which is there are issues that are challenging from a libertarian perspective. So, how do you deal with climate change? How do you deal with systemic racism of a really grinding form? How do you deal with a pandemic? And these are not easy. These are not like clear answers to that. Don't fall immediately out of libertarian theory, or it could point in different directions. These are challenging things. Um, and I think what a lot of libertarians do in these spaces is they say, look, the solution, the proposed solutions to this, proposed solution to global warming is a significant amount of government intervention. And that's what the people who are saying global warming is a big deal are saying therefore we need a significant amount of government intervention. I disagree with a significant amount of government intervention for kind of libertarian priors. Therefore, global warming must not be a big deal. Right? Like you go to the science must not actually support it. And this plays out like it plays out with climate change. It plays out with um, the pandemic, like a lot of the kind of conspiratorial that then turned into anti-vax and so on, I think came out of this is like, if all these people are right about the science, then maybe government is justified. Therefore, they must be wrong about the science. And and I think one, this kind of turns, I mean, they, like as we saw with COVID, it turned a lot of libertarians crazy. And then led them into like supporting Trump and really dark anti-liberal places. But two, I think what it does is it says, okay, even if like if there's a need for state intervention, it still is the case that like libertarians, because we have this particular perspective of like skepticism of state power, of like what it means to apply it, of the hidden costs in regulations and so on. It's important to have a voice in those conversations so that whatever solutions we come to are going to be the best possible ones, even if that entails a significant amount of state intervention. But they're kind of opting out of those conversations by just saying the problem doesn't exist in the first place. And therefore, the conversation is just happening between people who are maybe don't have as kind of the appreciation for like the benefits of markets or the risks of the state that they might. So the answer is I don't know what the correct answer is, but I think that libertarians tend to just opt out of those conversations because of like a fear that the correct answer might turn out to be state intervention, or because the best way to argue against state intervention in these realms is to simply say the problem doesn't exist to begin with.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And fundamentally, I agree with you that these are complicated questions, right? As a young progressive years ago, I did have that kind of reflex you were describing, where I'd say, well, is there a social problem? Obviously, you just pass a regulation that says not to have that social problem, and you're done. And I think as I've gotten older and I've both seen how dysfunctional our housing markets, especially our environmental laws, other kinds of things, I've come to be more skeptical of that reflexive move. Um, and so I think that there is an opportunity for productive dialogue here between progressives like myself and people who have a more libertarian history. And maybe we're not necessarily going to agree on everything, but I think, you like it or not, we're kind of working together now when it comes to defending freedom in America and defending, democracy in America. And so it's important to start thinking about, yeah, how do we have conversations with each other? So, Aaron, thank you so much for coming on Neoliberalism and chatting with me about it.
Thank you so much, Samantha.
All right, and thanks again for listening, and I'll see you all again next week.